In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro discusses the current situation at Columbia University, where students openly support terrorist groups like Hamas and engage in disruptive behavior on campus. Shapiro highlights the lack of action by university administrations in addressing these violations of student codes and the potential legal implications of such actions. Shapiro explains the legal obligations that universities have regarding free speech, which differ between public and private institutions. Public universities are bound by the First Amendment, which prohibits viewpoint discrimination. Private universities, on the other hand, have more leeway in restricting speech. Shapiro also mentions time, place, and manner restrictions that allow for neutral laws to regulate protests and demonstrations on campus. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is another factor that comes into play, as it mandates that universities provide a harassment-free environment based on race, color, or national origin. Shapiro acknowledges the complexity of balancing free speech rights with the obligations under Title VI, especially in cases where speech may be considered discriminatory or harassing. Shapiro points out that Columbia University has a student code of conduct that prohibits dishonesty, unethical behavior, and breaking the law. The code also emphasizes the importance of respectful conduct on campus. However, Shapiro criticizes the university for failing to enforce these rules when students engage in pro-terrorist activities and anti-Semitic behavior. Shapiro describes the ongoing protests at Columbia University, where students openly express support for terrorist groups and chant genocidal slogans against Jews. He highlights the hypocrisy of the university's response, which has allowed these activities to continue unchecked. He also criticizes the decision to move classes online as a response to the disruptions, calling it a cowardly move that prioritizes appeasement over upholding academic standards. Shapiro references a letter from the Biden administration reminding schools of their legal obligations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. He explains that universities risk losing federal funding if they fail to address harassment and discrimination on campus. Shapiro argues that Columbia University, by allowing pro-terrorist activities and anti-Semitic behavior, may be in violation of Title VI and could face consequences for their inaction. Faculty members at Columbia University and NYU are shown to be actively participating in these protests, creating human chains to block journalists and showing support for the anti-Israel encampments. The protesters are backed by far-left groups that fund anti-Israel activities, with ties to organizations like the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and Education for Just Peace in the Middle East. The intersectional ideology that underpins these protests is discussed, with Shapiro explaining how it links various social justice causes to support for terrorist groups. The protesters believe in a conspiracy theory that blames systemic discrimination for the underperformance of certain groups, including Palestinians in Gaza, despite their own choices and actions contributing to their situation. Shapiro criticizes the Democratic Party for failing to address the extremism and anti-Semitism displayed by the protesters. He points out the reluctance of Democratic leaders to confront the issue head-on, instead opting for a passive approach that avoids alienating radical voters. He also highlights the hypocrisy of left-wing figures like Eric Holder, who downplay the severity of the protests and defend the protesters' actions. Shapiro highlights the case of American hostages being held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip, including one individual who had his arm chopped off as proof of life. He criticizes Biden for not addressing these issues and instead focusing on criticizing the Israeli government at the behest of the protesters. Shapiro highlights the violent and anti-Semitic nature of the protests at Columbia University, where demonstrators wore Hamas gear, burned American flags, and harassed Jewish students. He emphasizes the importance of upholding the law and ensuring the safety and security of all students on campus. He commends Governor Greg Abbott of Texas and Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida for taking a strong stance against such protests and enforcing the law to maintain order on their respective campuses. Shapiro commends individuals like Speaker of the House Mike Johnson for speaking out against anti-Semitism at Columbia University and calling for accountability from the university's administration. He also praises Democratic leaders like Josh Shapiro for condemning the protests and advocating for the enforcement of laws to maintain order on college campuses. Shapiro predicts that the Democratic Party's failure to address the extremism within its ranks and the leniency towards anti-Semitic protests will have negative consequences for the party. He suggests that doubling down on support for such protests will alienate mainstream voters and degrade the reputation of Ivy League universities. Shapiro highlights the importance of upholding standards of academic excellence and professionalism in higher education institutions.